Hello everybody, Neon here from Artifact Academy. Today I have for you an interview with Elyot Grant of Lunark Studios, who are the makers of Prismata, a strategy game that is entered early access fairly recently. You can find it on Steam, but he's somebody who I actually encountered on the Artifact Reddit, and I learned a little about the game that he was behind, and I said, hey, you're somebody who's involved in game design. What are your thoughts on Artifact's game design, what we know so far about it, and some of the choices they've made in their mechanics, etc.? And he seemed to be pretty happy to talk about it, so we got a chance to do an interview a couple days ago, and able to post this right now for all of you to check out and see our thoughts on it. Hopefully you find it interesting. There's a lot of great content in there, I felt, and I had a lot of fun doing it. So without any further ado, let's get right to it.
Are you ready to have some fun?
Let's go to work!
Hello everybody and welcome. This is Neon here for Artifact Academy, and I'm joined today by Elyot of Lunark Studios. How are you doing tonight?
I am wonderful tonight. Nice to be here.
Nice to be here with you too. We're recording at midnight, by the way, which I think is just an interesting thing. Apparently, we're both just insomniacs, and this is works well. But maybe by the end of the cast, we'll get a little bit deranged. But for right now, I think that we're both nice and fresh for a midnight interview.
Yeah, I'm great. I do a lot of great work at night, so yep, happy to be here.
Very. Okay, so who are you? Is a really good place to start out with. So how about you give us a little bit of introduction? Because you are one of the developers for Prismata, which is a strategic game that's out on Steam right now, right?
That's right. So yes, I am the founder of a small indie company called Lunark Studios. We are a one-product company. We make a game called Prismata. It is in early access right now, coming out later this year. And we've actually been working on the game since 2010, which is a long freaking time. But for most of those years, it was sort of as just a hobby project on the side while we were in school. And then we started working on it full time and formed a real company and did a Kickstarter. And now we're launching the game this year.
It's great to hear. Now, for people just kind of don't really understand what we're doing here, good to give a little bit of an introduction as to sort of like what the purpose of our conversation is, because I'm here interviewing somebody who doesn't have any official knowledge about Artifact, and this is going to be like Artifact related content. You've been like kind of frequenting the Artifact subreddit, and you clearly have a lot of like thoughts I've seen in terms of your blog and stuff about game design. So I thought, hey, you'd be an interesting person to chat about game design with, and some of the things that you've seen so far in Artifacts, some of the things you've been seeing recently in card games in general, to kind of talk about sort of what you're seeing, what you think about the field. And especially, like I will get to this later, you have some interesting takes on the subject of RNG in games, which I know wouldn't necessarily be embodied by the design team of Artifact per se.
Yeah, I've written quite a lot about RNG. If you search like why is RNG bad, you may find one of my articles. We'll get to that.
Oh, we will, for sure. So you said you started the project of working on Prismata a few years ago in school, but let's go before that. So what's your like gaming history? Like, what are some of your top games from childhood forward?
I've actually been making games for about 20 years. Since I was a kid, I used to program crappy side scrollers in DOS.
Nice.
I used to play a lot of chess, a lot of StarCraft at a pretty high level. Just basically everything, when I was a kid, just Super Mario Bros, stuff like that. But yeah, I've been in gaming for a long time. I also have a background in like research level theoretical computer science, doing like heavy math. I was an MIT grad student for a while. Just doing like hardcore CS theory research, and I liked it. But I also really liked making games. And so at some point, I decided to go full-time on the games thing. And since that moment, I have not looked back. So that's where we're at.
That's great to hear. And it's one of those things you said, 2010 is when you started working on Prismata. It's one of those things that I think a lot of people don't realize how long game design can kind of take. I mean, that's still long for a game, but it like often can take several years from the beginning concepts to something actually seeing print, quote unquote.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I designed Prismata originally with a bunch of friends I went to school with, and we had always liked making games and variants of games and trying things out. And Prismata was just like, we literally had a few scraps of cardboard. We were playtesting this idea, and we found it so compelling that we just ran with it and kept adding more and more to the game, and developing new units for the game and new different game mechanics, and cutting the stuff that we didn't like, keeping the stuff we did. Eventually, our friends started playing, friends of friends. We built an online version because originally it was a tabletop game. And it just kind of grew from there. There's so many stories I could tell. We had a bunch of poker player friends who really loved the game, and they were like, "Hey, we'll give you some money to start a company and turn this thing into a real product."
Oh, wow, okay.
That's
cool.
That's how we got our seed funding for our company when we started out.
Really?
And then we did a Kickstarter. And we just continued developing the game, testing it on people, adding new stuff to it, adding single player content. And it's been a long journey. And then finally this year is the year we're releasing the thing.
So how about we then spend a little bit of time talking about Prismata itself, because I'm sure there's so many people here who are listening who don't know very much about it. It's a game that I personally actually just picked up last week, honestly, and I've since then just got really hard into it because it's been a lot of fun. So just give me your elevator pitch of the game, of what people would expect and what kind of players you think would like it.
Yeah, so typically we're a game that Hearthstone and Magic players like. But our game has no randomness and no pay to win. It is a turn-based strategy game where neither side has an advantage over the other by buying cards and building a deck. Instead, every time you sit down to play, the available units for purchase are different every game, and you have to kind of pick your strategy based on what's available. So if you played a deck building game like Dominion, it has that aspect. And the economy of the game is a little bit borrowed from RTS. You're actually constructing workers and earning resources every turn, rather than just filling up your mana pool or tapping your lands or something like that. So mechanically, it blends a lot of different things from different strategy games: RTS, turn-based strategy games, board games, card games. Some people think of it as being a bit closer to chess than poker, whereas something like Hearthstone, with all of the randomness, the card draw, the random effects, it feels a little bit more casual. Our game is definitely geared a bit more towards serious competitive play. We have casuals too. We also have a single player campaign, a full-on single player story campaign with characters and cutscenes and stuff like that. That is a premium product, so no microtransactions in that. But our multiplayer is a free-to-play product with cosmetic microtransactions. So there's no pay to win, there's no garbage, there's no your energy ran out, you have to put in more money to keep playing, anything like that. We just wanted to make the game we always wanted to play. Not one of these strategy games where you have to just empty your wallet every time a new expansion comes out.
Yeah, one of the things that you're describing in the game, I would definitely say that's been my experience of how you're describing it. The summary that I kind of came up in my mind was a cross between chess, StarCraft, and then the grindiest mid-range matchup in Magic that you can imaginable. Because a lot of because it's this idea of you're just eking out minor advantages and resources and trying to trade resources with your opponent and set up for future turns to do that. So it's a combination of all of those things of managing an economy, trying to just make favorable trades, and then also planning 3, 4, 5 turns in advance because you have perfect information about what both people have. That's actually one of the things maybe it'd be worth clarifying, because there's a set of units. Some of them are standard for every game, and then some of them are vary from game to game. And both players have access to the exact same ones, so both players know what one another is capable of.
Right. I tell people who are, say, Hearthstone players, just imagine Hearthstone where your deck is your whole hand, right? So there's no card draw luck. Now that game would suck because you just play the same opening every time, so it would be boring and it would be broken as fuck.
Oh yeah, it'd be really broken.
Have you seen
your opponents? They're pretty nutty.
Well, yeah, but you might literally sit down against your opponent and realize you have a 0% chance of winning, right? So to mitigate that, we do two things. One is both players have the same deck, and two is the deck itself is randomly chosen, or some of the deck is randomly chosen every game. And so that's kind of the way you could think about it if you're a Hearthstone player. If you're a StarCraft player or an RTS player, just think of it as like turn-based StarCraft with no map.
Yeah.
And no fog of war either. So you can see what your opponent's doing and sort of plan and counter based on what they buy. Those are kind of a couple of analogies, but really it's something genuinely different. And if you like any kind of strategy game, RTS, card game, you should definitely check it out, because it may be something you've never seen before that you never knew you wanted.
Yeah. So that's something that I think is some very interesting elements to it of sort of how the game ends up being developed. And one of the things also that it reminded me of, I don't know if you've seen this. There's a talk that was given by Richard Garfield. I think you might have referenced it in one of your articles, where he was talking about RNG in games. But one of the things that he suggested as a way that randomness could be introduced in RTS style games and StarCraft style games is having randomly costed technologies. Or the units having some random costs associated with them, and in some respects, I found that, or like the case of your game has some similarities with that, in the sense of like saying like, oh, it's not about which ones, like how much they cost, but it's which ones you have access to. So that's another interesting connection that I found.
Yeah, I think that idea has some merit, but the problem is like everybody just ends up with sort of a tier list of like which unit is good at which cost. And I think that it just turns into this calculation grind of like, is the unit good enough to get? Is the other unit good enough to get? Like in Prismata, we try to balance each unit so that it's like as meaningful as possible. In a game like Hearthstone, there's like the 5% of the release cards that everybody actually plays with, and the 95% is all junk. We don't have that 95%. Every single unit in the game, we try to make as meaningful and as good as possible, so that when you play with different units, you actually have a lot of different strategies available to you.
Yeah, that would actually be something then that I would like highlight as like I'm not saying that this is my thoughts of the game, but I'm saying like a hypothetical, criticism that you could imagine. If somebody says, look, you if you play the game enough, you could just solve for whatever unit is best under a given situation. It's like you see this like Steel Splitter. Let's just like use this as an arbitrary, simple example. So this is just one of the basic units of the game, is Steel Splitter. Like under these configurations of units, Steel Splitters are the best. So you should always be just like going for that, and that you could just somehow find a way to solve for everything, in the game of like when you should be going for like that unit versus like researching whatever technologies first, etc. So how do you kind of control for that in your balancing, so that it's not just a question of, oh, you should just always do this when the cards come up a certain way?
Yeah, it's actually quite fascinating, because when we originally prototyped Prismata, we just thought we would like sit down and solve it in a half hour.
Oh, really?
Because we had like the basic worker, the basic attacker, the basic wall, and like not much else. And we just figured, okay, well, player one starts with this, player two starts with this. Let's see if it's interesting. And it turned out that like we played it for a whole weekend and we couldn't solve it. We found a lot of viable lines for both sides. And we found the game tree got so wide so quickly that we couldn't prune it. Like, this is kind of the secret surprise of Prismata, was that it ended up being way deeper than we thought it would be, even with just very simple units. And so when you're playing a ladder game, let's say, where you have, the entire base set, which is the 10 or 11 units that are available every time, plus like 8 to 10 other units, the number of strategies available to both players is so large, and the number of ways of executing those strategies is so large, that it's very difficult to ever be certain that any move you make is the best move in that situation. A lot of the times Prismata feels sort of like creatively trying to find the best strategy to deal with a certain situation. And it's not just about optimizing. It's often just about like, what are you going to do? What's your actual game plan? And how do you figure it out? It's like, imagine a card game where like, you're playing Zoo in a certain, Magic or Hearthstone. You kind of, what you want to do. You want in the early turns to do this, in the middle turns do that. And if you get wiped, do this, right? In Prismata, you have to develop that type of game plan every time you play. And that's where like most of the skill comes in. It's not just about microing and optimizing how you attack and defend with each unit, but about like formulating a plan and executing it well.
Yeah, that is definitely something that like is definitely maximized in perfect information games as well, because it is something that, you know, in games like Eternal or Magic or Hearthstone, as soon as there's hidden information, you can you can only kind of go your decision tree so far, right? You know, because it's something that, like, you know,
Well,
I mean, you can go a certain, you know, distance, of course, and especially in Hearthstone, like there are some decks that you know all the contents, especially those are like your particularly types of combo decks. You're like, okay, like this is more or less the contents of their hand, but you know, so that's something that ends up being a pretty big difference, I think, in the style of gameplay.
Well, yeah, Hearthstone definitely has some of those moments where you're like counting outs, or you're counting your opponent's outs, or trying to decide whether you should, you know, play a control-y card this turn or wait. And I think those decisions are among the most interesting in Hearthstone. But I remember one time in a tournament that we were helping to host and cast, late in the game, there was this game where you know, one guy knew exactly what was in the other guy's hand, and they were down to, you know, the last little bits of fatigue, and there was no randomness involved. At that point, the game was essentially, for all intents and purposes, a deterministic, perfect information game. And like, it was one of the most interesting like chess games involved. I think it was Gara and maybe Kalento or maybe another player. And I just remember thinking, like, you know, that was actually the moment that I sort of saw as, this is what type of game I want to play, right? This to me is the most interesting fragment of Hearthstone, and Prismata just happens to be a game that's kind of all about that.
Yeah. So I think that that's a good way to describe, you know, Prismata. If you haven't checked it out so far, you can find it on Steam, right? Is the where most people would find it.
Yeah, so like, let me explain what we're doing with the product and the release. Right now, we are in a paid-only early access. Later, it will go free to play. Now, if you join the paid-only early access, you get the premium content, which is like the full single-player campaign, a bunch of online stuff. But if you want to wait, there will be a free version available later. And I do happen to sometimes give out keys to people on Reddit if they ask me for keys.
Yeah, who would be asking you for keys on Reddit?
We do a bunch of
what kind of randoms.
We'll probably be doing. Yeah, we'll probably be doing a free weekend in a couple of weeks. But for sure, if you ding me on Reddit, I can send you a key if somebody's really impatient or interested.
Yeah, actually, full disclosure, how I actually started talking with Elyot is I was playing the game because somebody gave me a key, and there, some friends of mine were asking, like some Discord friends of mine were asking, like, hey, can we get keys? I'm like, yeah, sure. I just saw him on Reddit, so I was going to go ask him, and that's what led to this. But so that's really good, and it's interesting to kind of like hear, you know, where these things progress. You know, check it out if you have it on a chance. But like, that'll kind of be the talk about, you know, Prismata itself, which I think is a good, you know, sort of context for things. We just wanted to spend the rest of the time talking about sort of broader thoughts and opinions on game design in general, and also like specifically in the context of Artifact, and also other TCGs that are sort of around. So I think that's actually a good thing to kind of start off with, and putting this out there, is how do you, as a game designer, kind of feel about other games kind of existing in general? Because it's one of those things that you could kind of imagine as like, oh, you know, like everything's kind of competition, but you also could go crazy with the fact is like, well, there's obviously going to be a lot of competition. I can't just like be super suspicious of everything. So how do you approach thinking about other games?
So like, here's an interesting story. When Hearthstone was announced, that was actually one of the things that made us decide we should go full-time with this game. Because we figured, you know, if Hearthstone gets announced, we're not seeing it as a competitor. We're seeing it as a product that will grow the genre and grow the audience for the type of game that we want to make. And our goal is not to make as much money as Hearthstone. Our goal is to make 1% as much money as Hearthstone, right? Like, that would be freaking great, right? We're a tiny little company. We're not Blizzard. So if we can make a product that appeals to the same audience, but is a little bit different, or is a little bit niche, or has something that's different, then that for us is very good. And we were very happy that Hearthstone came out. Now, then all these like Hearthstone clones came out to try and sort of take advantage of the popularity. And you'll see that whenever something becomes unexpectedly popular. And I don't necessarily see Artifact as falling into that category. But I do see like sort of trends in the market and the audience. Like a lot of older gamers, especially, they want short duration gameplay. They want not gameplay that focuses on dexterity as much like RTS games did. They want just to be able to chill out and play a game for 10 minutes. And I think we've seen a lot of games Like idle games, for example, got really popular in the last decade. Even things like visual novels. There are different types of gamers that want different experiences, and Hearthstone is definitely filling a void for a lot of people. But it's like we are constantly paying attention to what's coming out, what's available, what's being announced. Almost every game in this category I've played, or I've watched a lot of gameplay on Twitch. We know a lot of the developers too. It's something we got our ear to the ground on for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's important to understand that it's not just viewed as like, their Coke and your Pepsi. It's a question of also like it's an ecosystem, and it's true that players do prefer one over the other, but it's also something that there's also a certain degree of the more that people are just excited about strategy games, the better it is for you.
Absolutely.
So that's good to hear, and I just think that that's an important thing to kind of go into the context of this. That you're not just like, hey, I'm Prismata's developer, so I'm just here to talk about how great it is, and I'm gonna crap on Artifact to try to push it down. Like that's not.
I have very little crapping on Artifact to do.
Oh yeah, okay, that's good to hear. But
I could crap on Hearthstone all day, but like,
couldn't we all?
I mean, at the end of the day, like when we saw people asked about what they didn't like about Hearthstone, the number one two answers were the pay to win and the RNG. And so we found ourselves uniquely positioned as a product that can offer a solution to both of those issues. So.
Yeah. So I think that we'll spend some time now talking about like those two are some of the big ones that are elements of it. So let's start with the RNG and game design, because this is an interesting topic, and people who have been following my content before, I have a video out on my YouTube channel that talks about the philosophy of Richard Garfield's game design. So that's sort of summarizing some of his thoughts on things. So there's a section in there that talks about his thoughts on RNG and luck in gaming. I wrote an article that's on the same topic that you can find that on Artifact Academy. And there's a bunch of stuff. I'll leave links below in the description of the video to all this stuff. So I've written on the subject a lot. And there's a lot of great content out there. But for right now, for this conversation, let's sort of set the plate as to like what the real question is around here. So first off, like, why do some games have randomness to them? Like, what would we just just from that perspective, and not in terms of your particular stance on it, but what would you say is the reason why some games have randomness to them?
I mean, there are a lot of game design problems that RNG helps to solve. In a game like Magic the Gathering, Magic the Gathering is typically played at these local game store Friday night Magic events where you might get, 20 people, 40 people of varying skill levels. And if it were a chess club, if you had 20 people of varying skill levels, it's actually hard to find somebody that's really your level at a game like chess, just because being better at the game makes you so much more likely to crush somebody. And in Go, for example, you can give handicap stones and stuff like that, but it's much harder to do something like that for a card game. So RNG helps to mitigate the advantage that like having higher skill can have on win rate, which makes it, less likely that new players get completely demoralized because they can actually win. And that's like a huge factor in new players like enjoying themselves playing the game and sticking with it through those growing pains of learning a new game and having to build out a collection and all that stuff. There are other reasons too, like, creating exciting moments or increasing the diversity of gameplay, because, like I said earlier, if you just drew your whole deck on the first turn and could play whatever you want, you'd play the same openings every time. It would get very boring. The matchups would be pretty dull. So like RNG is sort of a tool in the game designer's toolbox that can be used to solve a number of problems in game design. And, my claim isn't necessarily that RNG is bad because it's a bad solution to those problems. In fact, it's a very good solution to many of those problems. The problem with RNG is that it can really undermine what I feel is the sort of competitive spirit of a game that wants to treat itself as, like in Hearthstone, they have a world championship. But when, a best of 5 series is decided by matches that maybe are a 55-45 ratio, like you can have an upset there quite a high frequency of the time. The best player is not going to win the tournaments. And there's so few tournaments that even if you are the best player, you don't have, it's not like poker where you can play hundreds of thousands of hands in order for for it to average out. You know, Hearthstone tournaments are sort of just like gambling, basically. You know, it's 10% skill, 90% luck. A lot of people have an issue with that. A lot of people just get frustrated when they're trying to ladder up and they're just getting crap draws and they're not able to, you know, feel like they're playing to their potential as a player because the outcome of games are decided by randomness rather than they themselves choosing what happens. So, you know, there's drawbacks to randomness, and my claim is that the vast majority of game design issues that randomness tends to solve can be solved through means other than the type of RNG that destroys the competitive spirit of games. At least that's what I think.
Okay, so that I think gives a good explanation, because I think that also it's, you know, in some respects there's also, you know, many layers to exactly like what it is people don't like, are the good things or bad things about RNG in games. On the one hand, you know, players just like to kind of complain about it, randomly, like that's just because, and oftentimes that can be a proxy for hiding how bad they are at games too. Like,
yeah, randomness can help to shield your ego from the fact that you might be shit at the game, right?
Yeah.
Like you can just blame that you got unlucky.
Yeah, like I was talking to somebody recently who says like, the only reason I lose with my control deck is when I don't draw the answers that I need. And it's like, I feel like you're just describing control decks here. Maybe it's a bit like you should be thinking more about, deck construction or, the way that you're sequencing your answers and stuff like that. You're just thinking about it in terms of, I just need to draw this stuff. It's like, maybe that's a simplistic way of viewing it. But, the question is like, becomes then also, sort of like where the game is trying to position itself. What is it you're kind of trying to achieve and do? Because it's something that like take something stupid like Monopoly. Sure. Like Monopoly, by many scores, is a whole very bad game outside of the randomness to it. But like the game is in no way, shape, or form like trying to be a real battle of wits competitive. It's kind of just something that you do with friends or family to kill some time. So
sure.
I think that like one of the big distinguishing features that you kind of are pointing to is that like if you're trying to be a serious competitive game, like you really have to think about the role RNG plays in your design.
Well, and I think it's not just about tournaments and leagues. It's also just about laddering. Like the main way that a lot of people experience Hearthstone is by playing ladder. And when you're trying to have a serious competitive ladder and your position, especially when like invitations to tournaments are decided by who's number one at the end of the month, and your position or your ranking in those last few hours are just going to depend on whether you got lucky in your last couple of games. Mm-hmm. Like there are serious issues with randomness as a way of deciding like who's the best at a game. There are so many people that blame RNG because it's responsible for a lot of their bad moments. But I also think that like once you've tried the other thing, right? Once you've tried Prismata, I just can't go back to playing Hearthstone or even Magic because I find that the number of hours I put into the game versus the amount of satisfaction I get from actually getting to interesting positions and making good decisions and winning because of my good decisions or losing because of my poor decisions. I just found that to me, it's just such a more valuable way of like using my time as a gamer rather than just, watching dice roll or watching a random Markov chain evolve.
So with that, though, in some respects, I see Hearthstone and Magic being kind of slightly different problems in the randomness. One of the things about like Hearthstone that is the people don't, I think, kind of really appreciate how the randomness in Hearthstone sort of works is in some respects the game, the core game engine of the game is actually very low variance. You have a small deck size, you have a very generous mulligan rule, and you have a hero power to offset bad draws. The difficulty is that in order to compensate for the fact that the games will become extremely dull and extremely repetitive, they often have to put in some cards that sort of amplify the variance. So like what cards that you can only put one copy of it in your deck, or cards that have an explicitly random effect on the game. And that seems to be like kind of deliberately put in there as like, hey, let's add a big dose of randomness, like sort of superficially, just to make the game more exciting.
I I don't think that the purpose of those randomness from a game design perspective is to increase variety in game experiences in that sense. I think it's a lot of to create these excitement moments where like a low probability event happens and it completely turns around the game, and it, you know, gives you this rush of adrenaline. It makes for those Twitch moments that get reposted to Reddit, and those actually help engage the viewers a lot. Just getting streamers to have crazy shit happen all the time is one of the things that helps market Hearthstone. So adding the crazy shit really helps sell packs. You know, but like my complaint is not really about like, oh, you know, I have to deal with this Ragnaros where I have a 50-50 chance of winning. Like, even just if you play the basic game and you're playing Zoo, and like, you know, if you don't draw a good one drop, your chance of winning drops dramatically. You know, if you get a crappy mulligan, you could be in a situation where your chance of winning is 10% after 2 turns. And you know, it's like I compare it to League of Legends. In that League of Legends, there's often situations where you have like a 3% chance of winning. Like, you're completely getting dumpstered by the other team, and you just keep playing in hopes that they like make a mistake and maybe you can come back. And, you know, 97 times out of 100, you're just going to get dumpstered. And more often than not, it's going to take a long time because the other team's playing conservatively because they don't want to mess up and allow you to come back, right? So, like, you just end up being dragged through the mud for like 15, 20 minutes, and that's no fun. And Hearthstone is the same thing. You know, you get a bad draw, like, there's nothing you can do. You can hope that something happens, but 9 times out of 10, you just get your face dragged through the mud and you have to queue up again. And you think, you know, screw this RNG. Independently of whether, you know, Ragnaros or whatever random effect of the day, you know, destroys your win and turns it into a loss. I don't think that that's really the most miserable thing about RNG. I think it's being dragged through the mud.
Yeah. So I think like also it's something that, you know, particularly with you know, League of Legends, and there's like a bunch of like board games, and I can think about this as well, where the alignment of when the critical moment in the game happens and when the game ends can often be like really far apart from one another, and that's something that I think is a pretty big problem in the game design of certain games. Like there's some, like, for instance, the one that I think is particularly the worst for this is Catan, actually. Because like there are like you've played Catan, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So for people who haven't played it, if you're playing in a 4-player game of Catan, especially like the base set of the game, almost always one of the 4 players has about a 10% chance to win. You know, like 3% chance to win from the first turn of the game. You know, there's usually one person who just gets dumpstered from the beginning. You know, I mean, like, has that been your experience, or is it?
Yeah, I honestly don't play a lot of 4-player.
No, that's yes. Totally fine. But like, and I can understand the reasons why. I like. There's a lot of people who like Catan a lot more than I do. I have problems with it. But like, that's one of the elements of it that I find so frustrating, because if you're playing 4K player Catan, there's going to be one person who's kind of left off kind of in a corner and has no availability to really make any progress in the game, or get some unlucky rolls in the first few minutes. And as a result, has to sit there for, you know, whatever it is, an hour, and lose, you know, for that entire time.
Yeah, and I mean, here's where the RNG comes into it, right? Because in chess, when a player like loses their queen, they just resign, right? Yeah. They're not going to play on hoping that their opponent screws up and loses their queen, because they respect their opponent, right? At least at a high level. And Prismata is kind of the same. Like, if you get breached and you just get completely annihilated, you just resign. It's the same in StarCraft, you know? If you like, you know, your opponent has 4 bases and they just kill your 3rd and now you got nothing, you know, you just resign, right? It makes the experience of losing a lot less unpleasant by shortening its duration.
Yeah, so in some respects, I could also see, like, this is sort of a 2 sides of the same coin thing of comparing one of the things that, you know, that Garfield, you know, lead designer for Artifact, and Mark Rosewater too, lead designer for Magic the Gathering, you know, points to is like, it's like, well, those moments where you have this low probability of winning and then you come back are amazing. And then you're kind of saying, it's like, well, that's not accounting for the, you know, large percentage of the time that you sit there and lose. And, you know, you can kind of like there's obviously like validity to both of these things, like the, you know, exciting moments where you know, run hot and, you know, pull out of the bad situation are really exciting. And those are really dramatic, you know, fun moments, and like also do require a lot of skill too. Like, if you correctly play to your outs for multiple turns, and fade the lightning bolt and try to get exact lethal right before your opponent gets lethal, like that's really exciting. And skill intensive too. But you're kind of saying like, yes, it's true, but that's kind of discounting all the time that you're miserable.
I mean, people often remember their most memorable experiences, right? The things that are most salient, that one top deck that allowed you to win the tournament. And that's fine. But like Prismata has a lot of those moments too, and they're not necessarily created by a top deck. They're created by like, oh, I offered this really risky gambit and my opponent decided to take it and then they lost, or they decided not to take it and they lost, or I made this weird tech switch in the middle of the game and it somehow won it for me. Like, people do have these battle stories about crazy Prismata matches that they won. Sometimes where they were down to one worker left and they built stuff up with it. It just comes in a different form. And I think that any game that is designed well will have exciting moments, and it's not necessary for randomness to be a part of the source of the excitement.
So how about that we talk in some respects like the specifics of the way in which RNG is implemented in Artifact? Like how you're familiar, like have you been following kind of the details of like what's been revealed so far about the game mechanics and such?
Yeah, roughly. I mean, so there's card draw randomness. There's that initial placement of the minions in the lanes. And I guess the stuff that's in the shop is also random,
attacking
right?
is random too, in terms of the variety, like the
targets
that they're attacking.
Yeah. Like most of it seems, I don't know. Like, I'm worried about the shop. If something you really need is in the shop and it comes late, that feels like it could be frustrating, but we'll have to see. Like, I think this is very much a Garfield style game. I've played some of his board games, for example. He likes these types of mechanics, and they do make for interesting player choices and decisions. Whether or not it leads to a lot of frustration, we'll have to wait and see. I mean, there's so many games in which RNG has been the source of frustration. Wherever RNG exists, somebody will find a way to complain about it. So, I'm not expecting anything that different. But I think a lot of the design problems of Magic, for example, like Mana Screw and stuff, modern games don't have those problems, at least. So I do think designers are getting better. So I don't know. I have some hope that maybe Artifact will be a good implementation, but we'll have to see.
Yeah. So one of the things, actually, maybe why don't you just elaborate on that? Like what you were saying about like a very Garfield design, a very Garfield mechanic. What do you mean by that? I'm actually just wondering.
What's the game I have like literally on my shelf right behind me? King of Tokyo. Yeah, that's a Richard Garfield game. It has some like crazy busted ass random mechanics that can just like completely kill your opponent if you get lucky enough for them to happen. It's sort of a dice rolling and re-rolling game like Yahtzee.
Yeah.
And it does create these moments that are just, face melting frustration / exhilaration. But I would never want to, try to be the best competitive King of Tokyo player, right? It's just not that kind of game. So we'll have to see where we lie on that sort of fine balance between too much or fair enough. I think the one thing that's never going to happen is we're going to never see games where you have the poker effect of you could play 100,000 hands and it will actually average out. That's kind of the problem. It's never going to average out in games where the duration of a match is 10 or 15 or 20 minutes and you're only playing one of them at once, and tournaments are best of fives. Like it's just not going to happen.
Well, so one of the things I also think about in terms of these different types of games, because to me, I actually sort of think that they all are different games are sort of approaching this question of fun and strategy in different ways, and I can see the attraction to each of them. So in some respects, I see them as being these slightly different genres. So it's part of the reason why, like chess, for instance, is so like universal and it's just never going to go away. Because it's it is a very good implementation of a perfect information strategy game with absolutely no variance and no like random generation in it whatsoever. Like obviously, like the new Prismata is has the variance of the units that are available to you, but there's no luck in the game per se. So the kind of a difference there in terms of like the exact target that they're sort of going for. But the fact that, because one of the things I talked to with people who are saying like, yeah, I just want to remove all of the the variance in games, all of the having people with 100% skill intensive, etc. I'm always kind of like, well, chess exists. It's a game that's already out there. And that, like, I mean, I think that Prismata is a good evidence. Is like, well, maybe there's other implementations of this that don't necessarily have to be chess, but
Oh yeah,
go ahead.
Like that argument pisses me off so much because I like chess. Chess is not a game for every Hearthstone player that wants no randomness. They're such radically different games. Chess is a game where, to play well at a high level, you're often thinking like 4 or 5 turns ahead. It's chess is very much a game about how much RAM you have in your brain. And Prismata isn't like that. A lot of card games are not like that. They're not about planning 5 turns ahead, thinking if I do this, he does this, I do this, he does this type of thinking. And they're not about memorizing openings. Chess is a huge, like, you have to spend hours and hours studying openings if you want to be a master level player. And a lot of people, they don't want to do that. They don't got time for that. It's not the same game at all. And I think there's a tremendous amount of unexplored space in competitive modern games with no randomness and no hidden information. Like, as far as I'm concerned, Prismata is kind of the only game that's making a serious effort in that department. And whenever I see a new game come out, I'm always wondering if they're, maybe they're also going in that same direction. Like, when we heard about Artifact, maybe Artifact's a game kind of like Prismata. And every time it turns about, no, it's not even close. It has randomness. You have to buy packs and build decks. Like, I think there's a certain motif that Magic the Gathering and now Hearthstone have set up, and that all these other games have decided, well, if we want to make money, we better just do the same thing that all these other games are doing because they're making money.
Yeah, and I don't. I'm going to object to that, though, because it's something that it's not just a question of like to me, it's this idea of I think that the strategy of playing around randomness is an interesting feature to these games. And it
certainly
and
is.
It's something that like part of how I'm thinking of it. It was like chess is in this one area of no variance and no luck. Prismata has some variance in the sense of the units that are available to you, but no luck. And then,
well, we compare it to like Fisher random chess, which is chess where the back ranks have been randomized, and there's no like opening studying, for example, in Fisher random.
Yeah. So, but those are, like one is in one category, the other is in a slightly adjacent category. And then also you have, like Magic and Hearthstone and Artifact, which are in this, different category of, there is variance, there is randomness in part of the game, and you have to play around that. And then kind of in the most extreme example is poker, which is basically just a game of betting on chance. Like it's about trying to do odds and possibilities and calculations, and you just do that again and again and again. So it's kind of this extreme, like different levels of to what degree are you just making decisions around like where the randomness is in the game, and they're different, meeting slightly different needs. Does that make sense?
Well, I think as far as the psychographics of players go, there are some players that just prefer to play a certain style of game, and I think there's a vast unexplored area in between chess and Hearthstone.
I agree with that. That I think is a very good point.
And the problem is that like a large company is probably not going to be the one exploring that space, just because it's too risky to develop a high budget project and then find out nobody wants to play it or nobody likes it, right? So if you're looking for something in that space, you're looking for indies, you're looking for small projects, something like that.
So I actually was wondering then, one of the thoughts that came to me in preparing for this is just the question of whether there's other, opportunities and stuff like that are, possible in this. I don't know how much you've thought about this of different alternative, you don't have to give me details if you have some, a game design idea in the back of your mind of alternative implementations of a no luck game, but still has some of these features to it, that you had in mind.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, even when we were starting designing Prismata, we tried like 5 different combat systems. We tried
Oh wow,
so many
okay.
different economic systems. We tried versions of the game where there were like zones you had to put your cards in. I guess that's kind of similar to what Artifact is doing. Um, we tried versions where you had to sort of like kill a totem that your opponent had or something like that, like with different objectives even. Um, we explored a lot of that space during the first couple of years before we sort of decided on what we have now. There's tons of space there. I think any single one of those prototypes could have been made into a game that ultimately was good. We just went with kind of the rule set that we liked the best, but it's not to say the other ones couldn't have ultimately turned out to be good, because you can't really decide which rule set is the best without like building a whole game around each rule set. So at some point we're just kind of play testing and going with our gut, right? There's so much.
Okay, we're 2,000 hours deep into the first one. Let's go to the second one now. I don't think that's how it works. You're going to start off. You gotta have to commit and go with it.
I mean, there's a big difference between hobby game design, where we're just trying to design a game that we want to play, versus professional game design, where you're trying to design a product that will ultimately be marketable to a big audience, right? There's a different set of constraints. And especially with free-to-play products, you have to design your game from day one with monetization in mind. Otherwise, you're not going to sell anything.
Now, speaking of selling things, maybe we should spend some time talking about like another topic that I think is really interesting in terms of where Artifact is going, and also where Prismata is right now. And it's a subject that I think is becoming more and more prominent within card game, like discussion circles and just gaming in general. And that's about economy, business models, and monetization.